The recording is now going. Awesome. So like I said, we have this organization in plants here. Plants have cells, they have tissues, they have organs. All right, so it's not going to be the organs we might find in animals and humans, such as like a stomach, for example. But they're going to have organs in a different sense. All right, so if we think about cells, they're kind of the fundamental unit of life. All right, cells are going to make up everything that we're composed of, right? If we go any smaller than cells, now we're starting to talk about different molecules and atoms. All right, we're going to start at the cellular level. A group of cells together would be tissues. All right, so a tissue is a grouping of cells that's going to perform some sort of specialized function. Right, so maybe that's function and protection, maybe that's transportation, whatever that function might be. And then organ. Right? So an organ is a grouping of tissues that will carry out a particular function. Right? And we're going to start at the organ level. We're going to go from big to small. Whoa, I have no idea what that was. All right. So if we start at the plant organs, all right, you should have kind of gotten an overview based on that video that you watched here. But we have 3 plant organs. All right, we have the roots, we have the stems, we have the leaves. All right, so if we had to break a plant into 3 different components, we would do roots, stems, and leaves. Now, between these different organs, we have a division of labor, and we typically classify these organs into 2 different systems. All right, so we have the root system. It's pretty easy, contains the roots. All right, but then we also have our shoot system. So the shoot system has the leaves and the stems, everything that's above ground, essentially. All right, now these 2 systems, they're interdependent on one another. Right? One cannot function without the other. Right? So for example, the roots can take up water, right? But they can't photosynthesize. The leaves, they can photosynthesize, but they're not very good at taking up water. All right? So they're very much interdependent on one another. All right, so if we look a little closer at the roots, all right, we have kind of these 3 major functions we're going to talk about. They can help anchor the plant into the soil, all right, so that plant isn't just going to tip over at the first opportunity that it has. It's going to give resources to the plant, all right, so when I say resources, I'm talking about water, I'm talking about nutrients, all right, those resources can be found in the soil that it is planted in. And then finally, it can store resources, all right? Some more than others. So if we take up, say, we're photosynthesizing a bunch, we're turning that light energy into sugars, we need some place to store those sugars. The roots can act as a storage unit. All right, so typically when we look at plants, we have a little bit of anatomy here that we'll learn. So the primary root is going to be the first root that emerges from the seed. All right, so those radishes, those mung beans that we are growing upstairs in the greenhouse, the very first thing to stick out of the seed, the very first root, is going to be the primary root. All right, now that primary root can lead to, say, a primary taproot. All right, in this instance of our image here, it can grow thicker, become more of a taproot where it's very thick and shoots straight down. Right, but off of whatever type of root it is, whether it's a taproot or not a taproot, right? Not all plants have this really thick taproot to them. Right, anything branching off of the main root is going to be the lateral roots. All right, so we can see we have a lot of lateral roots here. All right, that's really plays a role in anchoring that plant into the soil. So I don't know if you've ever tried to weed a garden, maybe pulled some dandelions out from the ground, and you notice they're really hard to pull out. It's because they have a lot of these lateral roots. All right, these lateral roots are really firmly embedding this plant into the ground. All right, so the second thing that roots do is acquire resources. All right, so one adaptation we can find on roots are root hairs. All right, so if we look at this seedling here, it looks like it's kind of fuzzy. Sometimes if you grow seeds and you're not really sure what you're looking at, you might mistake this for some sort of mold growth. All right, they're really thin, really slender hairs, all right, that grow off of this main primary root. All right, and the purpose of this is to increase surface area. Right? So if we're increasing the surface area, we're increasing the area that we can find water, that we can acquire nutrients in. Right? So I put up this image here that kind of gives you an idea of how we're going to acquire water and nutrients from the soil. We'll talk more about this next week, right? But essentially, all these little root hairs, we're increasing the surface area so we can get in more water and more nutrients. Nutrients are typically bound to the outsides of different soil particles. And like I mentioned before, some roots are have a specific purpose, especially if they're a type of taproot. They can be specialized for food storage and known as a storage root. Right? So carrots are a good example. Radishes are a good example. Right? They are storing resources in that root that plant can rely on when resources eventually become scarce. All right, so we're going to move on to the shoot system next. All right, it might seem a little bit more complex, but we're going to focus on two major functions of the shoot system. One is, again, resource acquisition. Right? This time we're talking about above ground. So mainly we're talking about light, right? As well as reproduction. Right? So any floral parts that come off of the stem would be part of reproduction here. So we're looking at stems particularly. All right, just looking at the stems, we're going to ignore the leaves for this part. These stems, they help with plant orientation. All right, and we'll probably see this, all right, as the results of our experiment that we'll look at on Friday. And when we can orient our plant, such as this plant at the bottom here, towards the light source. All right, so phototropism is occurring in that plant there. All right, so they can orient the plant so that its leaves can find the light. But they can also do photosynthesis in some species, right? So not all plants are going to have photosynthetic stems, but if you look at a plant and the stem looks green, right, it is photosynthesizing. So a good example is this plant down here, which I do not remember the name off the top of my head, but this plant I believe is a latex-producing plant. We used to have this in the greenhouse upstairs. I'm not sure if we still have it, but we can see it's green. Those stems are green. They are photosynthesizing. One kind of unique thing is if you've ever been to the desert and seen a prickly pear cacti, all right, we see these big, flat, broad, what's typically thought of as leaves, right? Those aren't actually leaves. Those are stems, right? And they are photosynthesizing. On the prickly pear cactus, they don't have traditional leaves. Their leaves are actually those spines that grow out, right? They have modified leaves. So in this case, the stem is the main photosynthetic organ. In terms of reproduction, right, stems are important in basically showcasing the reproductive structures, right? Supporting the flowers, orienting them to wherever they need to be. Normally it's going to be at the top of the plant, nice and showy. Sometimes it might be found at the bottom of the plant if you're trying to attract, say, beetles or insects that will crawl along the ground, right? But typically we have them on the top of our plant here, right? So again, we can see these modified stems of the prickly pear, showcasing that reproductive structure. All right, so the other organ of the shoot system is the leaves. All right, the leaves play a really important role as they are the main photosynthetic organ. Right, they are the organ that provides the plant with most of their food. All right, so we talk about photosynthesis, and we'll get to that a little bit later this week. All right, the process of photosynthesis is we are taking in carbon dioxide, CO2, from the air, all right, and turning that CO2 into photosynthase. So photosynthase is essentially a fancy word for saying a molecule that is produced via photosynthesis. All right, typically this is going to be in different sugars. All right, so we're taking CO2 from the air, and we're taking it into the leaves and fixing it into a molecule of sugars. Now, leaves also play a very important role with gas exchange, and that kind of goes hand in hand with photosynthesis. All right, as part of photosynthesis, we're also going to produce oxygen. All right, so the leaves have openings on them called stomata where the oxygen can be released and where they can take in the CO2 that they need for photosynthesis. All right, so leaves, huge role, photosynthesis, gas exchange. I threw up an image up here of the pores where gas exchange actually takes place. So this is a stomata. Right? This is where the gases will escape out of the leaves. All right, so part of what I do in my lectures is I like to take a break and kind of have you reflect on what we just learned, take a chance to ask me any questions that you don't want to ask in front of the whole class, and answer a question that I put up on the board. All right, so with your neighbors, I just want you to go over what important processes the roots, the stems, and the leaves perform. And while you do that, I'm going to start our seeding chart. Be creative in how I make this. All right. I'm starting. All right, so it seems to have quieted down a bit here. I'm assuming that means we've answered our question. All right, so what important processes do the roots do? Yeah. They anchor the plant. That's one of them.
They take in water and nutrients from the soil.
Yes, resource acquisition. They're getting water and nutrients. And what's the last one? They can store resources. Yes. All right, what about the stems? What might they do?
Support the plant.
They can support the plant. Yes. So support the plant in a couple different ways. What can they do?
They support leaves and flowers.
Yeah, they can showcase the reproductive system, support the leaves. Yep. So reproduction, and what else could they potentially do depending on the species? Photosynthesize, yeah. So stems, it's rare, but they can photosynthesize. All right, what about the leaves? What can they perform? Photosynthesis, and as part of photosynthesis, they can also? Gas exchange, yes. All right, so any questions on that so far? I know we're keeping it pretty basic at this point. All right. So we're going to move on to tissues, and this is probably where we're going to move into some territory with some terms you might not have heard before. All right, so we're talking about tissues. We're talking about groups of cells that together perform some sort of specialized function. All right, so in plant tissues, we have three major plant tissue types, right? Those are dermal, vascular, and ground tissues. Right, and we're going to go over these and define them a little bit more clearly here. All right, so we're going to start with dermal tissues because I think they're the easiest to understand. All right, so dermal tissues serve as the outer protective tissue of the plant. So if you look at a plant, you're probably looking at dermal tissue. All right, it's the outermost layer of cells. They are protecting the plant, providing a barrier from the outside, keeping in moisture inside. All right, and there's a couple different layers that we could talk about when we're looking at the dermal tissue. All right, so I have put up here a cross section of a leaf. All right, so if I took a leaf and I cut it in half and looked at the little thin strip that I cut, all right, I'd be looking at something similar to this. All right, so on the top here, we have this layer of cells. All right, that would be the upper epidermal cells. All right, so they're a layer of tightly packed cells typically found in non-woody plants, right? That we can find them on the top, but we can also find them on the bottom, on this lower epidermis, right? So anywhere we have the surface of a plant that is butting up against the outside, we have our epidermal cells here. But we also have this layer. It's not really a layer of cells. It's actually kind of this waxy layer that is on top of our epidermal cells. And this is called the cuticle. All right, so we see this very, very thin layer on top of our epidermal cells. All right, that is the cuticle. It's very waxy, and it helps prevent water loss from the leaves. All right, that way the leaves can retain the water that they need inside of their leaves, and it's not constantly evaporating out. All right, if we look at maybe some specialized epidermal cells, all right, a common one that we will see on every plant that we ever look at is guard cells. All right, so these guard cells, pictured down here, all right, they kind of look like a mouth, right? There's two cells on either side, and that's what makes up the stomata. All right, so this is where gas exchange is occurring. Very specialized type of dermal tissue cells. We also have trichomes. All right, so if you've ever felt a plant and maybe it felt a little fuzzy, right, those are trichomes. And basically they're the dermal layer with really thin epidermal cells that kind of come out of that tissue layer. All right, so here we have some epidermal cells. These cells actually are producing sugars that might help a fly stick to it if it's a carnivorous plant, or attract pollinators to it. All right, but we can also look at other cells that are just very long, they're skinny, they are on the outer layer of our dermal tissue. Those would be trichomes. And then finally root hairs. All right, we've already talked about root hairs. All right, they're increasing the surface area for resource acquisition on our roots. All right, so that was the dermal tissues. The next type of tissue would be vascular tissue. All right, so vascular tissue, we are transporting materials throughout the plant, but they can also provide support. All right, so these tissues tend to be a little bit more rigid. They help support the plant and keep it upright. If we're talking about these tissues that are transporting mainly water, but also some minerals up the plant, that would be the xylem. All right, but if we're talking about maybe transporting mainly sugars, we're going to be talking about phloem. All right, so xylem is going to transport water up the plant. It's always going to be up the plant, all right, from the roots up through the shoots to the leaves, and eventually that water will leave through the stomata. All right, now phloem can be multi-directional. All right, they can travel in multiple different directions. They are transporting the sugars from where they are made to where they are needed. All right, so they could move from the leaves to the roots. They could move from the stems to the leaves. Right? Maybe the leaves to the floral structures, wherever the sugars are needed in the plants. They don't necessarily go from the roots to the shoots. I threw up this image of a bunch of cross sections. If we're looking at our vascular tissue here, typically we'll see it in the middle here. All right, depending on the type of plant we're looking at, it can look like this cross shape. All right, we have our xylem and we have our phloem. It can look kind of like this. I always think it looks like a shocked face to me, with two eyes and a mouth wide open. Right? These are pretty typical for how we might see the vascular structures laid out. Oh, and I labeled them. All right, xylem and phloem. I forgot about that animation. All right, so the last tissues we're going to look at are ground tissues. All right, so ground tissues are easy to remember because they are tissues that are not vascular, they are not dermal. All right, so tissues that are not found on the surface of the plant and tissues that do not provide support in transport. All right, now they can provide a little bit of support. I will put that caveat in there. But typically when we look at ground tissues, we look at a cross-section of a stem. So again, we have taken a stem, cut it in half, and we're looking at the round part that we have cut open. All right, we can categorize the ground tissue in two different ways. One is the pith, all right, so that's going to be interior to our vascular tissues. So in here, our vascular tissues are arranged as a ring around the outside of our cross section. So the pith would be all the tissue inside, and the cortex would be all the tissues outside. All right. So our vascular tissues, we're always going to see them in kind of like this bundled shape. Now, ground tissues, we kind of define them as everything that's not something, all right? They're not dermal, they're not vascular, but they play huge, major roles in a plant. Most importantly, they are the tissues that have photosynthetic cells, all right? They are able to provide photosynthesis. They do provide support, depending on where we are looking at in the plant. They can provide storage, and also some very, very short distance transport. So when I'm talking about short distance transport, I am talking from maybe the distance of a couple of cells, all right, not the entire plant. All right, so if I were to look at this image, and might have you label this image, all right, if I were to look at the dermal tissues, where might I look on this image and put my arrow?
Like the very outside.
The very outside, yeah. So what do dermal tissues do? They protect, yeah. So if I were to drag this arrow, right? Oh, can't do that while I am presenting. All right, I would drag it to the very outside there. All right, this very fine layer at the very edges of our cross section. All right, what about the vascular tissues? Where might I find that in this cross section? Yeah, the rings. Right? So what do vascular tissues do? Mainly transport, yes, but also support. So if we're looking at vascular tissues, they typically show up as bundles. So in this image, we see these bundles and that ring along the outside. Right? So I could move this over to one of these bundles. All right? And the last type of tissue, ground tissue. All right, where might I put my arrow here? I could put it in the center, and that would be called what? The pith, yep, because it's interior to our vascular tissue. So I could put it in the center. I could also place it somewhere else.
Is it the stuff around those like rings and bundles?
Yeah, exterior to the vascular tissue. All right, so we have the pith, and then outside of our vascular tissue, we have the cortex. All right, so I could place it there. For sake of not confusing that with the dermal tissue arrow, I'm just going to place it in the middle in the pith. All right, any questions about our plant tissues? All right. So a couple of class questions for you to reflect on what we learned. All right, I am giving you different types of cells, telling you what they do and what they function as. Your goal is to figure out what type of tissue they would be classified into. All right, so work together, discuss these questions. Let me know if you have questions. Priya. All right. I knew it was in this area somewhere.
Yeah, because the chloroplasts
it sounds like we probably thought about these questions here. All right, so the first question, we have xylem and phloem cells that transport water and nutrients to the plant. What type of tissue do they belong to? Vascular, yes. All right, what about mesophyll cells, which are cells that perform photosynthesis? Ground, yes, awesome. So as you're studying for the test, these questions are types of questions that could show up, all right? Maybe not specifically the same, but they might be formatted something similar.
I think I might be missing some things. So could you explain why the mesophyll cells would be in the ground tissue? Because we were thinking it was the
Dermal tissues, yeah, which could be confusing because we see green when we look at a plant, right? Typically, these mesophyll cells, let me back up here. All right, so if we look at our cross-section of our leaf here, the epidermal cells are just going to be a singular layer thick. All right, so these green chloroplasts and the mesophyll layers will typically show through. Right, but these epidermal cells are not going to have chloroplasts, and they're not going to perform photosynthesis. Their only goal is to provide protection. All right, so making sure gases and water do not escape easily from the cell. All right, but we can see the mesophils, the colors from the mesophils show through because it's only one cell layer thick. All right, so the mesophyll cells will be part of ground tissues because they're not providing protection and they're not providing transport. All right, so they're everything else. Does that make more sense? All right, any other questions? Yeah.
What did you mean by non-woody plants?
So plants that don't have what we would think of as like wood to them. So think about like grasses. They don't have wood. Anything that doesn't have like a bark to them. Yeah. So a lot of bushes would be woody. Trees, obviously. Any other questions? All right. Cool. All right. So we're going to talk about the last unit of organization here, which are cells. And this is the point where I can almost guarantee you that you've probably not heard a lot of these terms. All right, they're some of my favorite terms in plant biology, though, because they're fun to say. All right, so before we get to those terms, let's just talk broadly about a cell, because I know I have a lot of non-science majors in here. You probably talked about cells in high school or whatever science class you had. All right, but when we look at a cell, right, and I have an image of a plant cell up here. All right, we're going to see the nucleus, right? That's going to be big and prominent in the middle, all right? That's housing the DNA. We have all these different compartmentalized functions, right? So, for example, this would be a chloroplast, and its only function is for photosynthesis, right? And this would be an example of an organelle. All right, so if I say organelle, I'm talking about these very compartmentalized functions, membrane-bound components inside of a cell. All right, so that might be the chloroplast, it might be a mitochondria, it might be the Golgi apparatus. All right, for the purpose of this class, I'm not going to define most of the organelles, right, because we are focusing specifically on plants. Now, if we look at cells, there's going to be a variety of cells. Depending on where we are looking in the plant, they're going to vary in size, in shape, in their specialized functions. All right, so for example, not all plant cells will have chloroplasts, right? Think about those epidermal cells, right? They don't have the chloroplast in them. But those mesophyll cells in the ground tissues, they would. All right, so I talked about membrane-bound organelles. All right, so I just want to kind of focus in on what I'm saying when I'm talking about membranes. All right, because later on we're going to talk about transport of like water and nutrients, and we'll get more in depth on how that happens across membranes. But for now, I just want to introduce that a membrane is a phospholipid bilayer. All right, so what that means is we have two layers of phospholipids. So a phospholipid is this molecule up in the corner there. All right, it has this head and then it has this tail structure. All right, this tail structure tends to be hydrophobic, which means it's water-fearing. So if it's water-fearing, it does not want to come in contact with water. So they orient those tails so they are towards each other. Right? They're trying to stay away from any water that might be in the cell or around a tissue, right? Whereas these heads, these pink pieces here, right, they're water loving, so they don't mind touching water, right? They are oriented towards the outside of this phospholipid bilayer. All right, so 2 layers of these phospholipid molecules. All right, we typically call this phospholipid bilayer the plasma membrane, right? That's going to be the membrane that's going to surround the entire cell, all right? And this plasma membrane is important because it allows for transport and regulation of substances, right? So we can transport different molecules into the cell, but it can also regulate which molecules it wants to take in, all right? So it might not allow just everything to come into the cell, all right? It might have some gates to say, nope, we don't want this molecule right now. That one's going to stay outside of my cell, right? So there's regulation going on. But they can also play an important role in signaling to other cells, which again, we're not going to touch on too much here, but we can have some signaling molecules that can tell something to other cells, all right? So again, these plasma membranes, they are found encasing the cell as a whole, but also all those organelles. All right, so we're focusing on plant cells, which means I'm not going to talk about animal cells basically at all. But I do want to look at what makes a plant cell unique from an animal cell. All right, so one of the first things, if you look at this image, what sticks out to you? That's the main difference between our plant cell and our animal cell. Chloroplasts, yeah. So we have chloroplasts in our plant cells. We don't have that in our animal cells. That's one of the main differences. What about in shape?
The plant cell has a cell wall.
Yeah, so the plant cell has a cell wall, which gives it this really rigid shape. All right, animal cells, they don't have this really rigid shape. All right, they're more fluid, and we typically see them as rounded more often. All right, but plant cells have these cell walls, which make them really rigid. All right, so if we look at the main differences, we mentioned most of them. All right, we're going to look at the chloroplasts. Right, we're going to look at the cell walls, which animal cells do not have. We're also going to look at the vacuoles. So the vacuole is this structure in the middle here. Right? It's typically very, very large in plant cells. They do not tend to be this large in animal cells. All right? And the reason being is they will tend to store a lot of water and nutrients. And we'll cover that in just a second here. All right, so if we look at chloroplasts, all right, they play a huge role in photosynthesis. All right, they are the site of photosynthesis, and they are going to convert solar energy to chemical energy. All right, so they are using the energy from the sun to create sugars. Now, chloroplasts are going to have many, many membranes, which are going to aid in photosynthesis. So we have an outer membrane, we have an inner membrane. All these stacks, which are called thylakoids, also have membranes. Right? They have a lot of membranes inside of our chloroplasts. All right, we'll go over a little bit more in depth on the anatomy tomorrow. All right, but one of the other big differences between animal and plant cells is this really large vacuole. So like I mentioned, vacuoles are storage vesicles. Right? They tend to allow for the storage of water and nutrients. So in plants can't move. They can't seek out more resources. They are stationary. So they use these vacuoles to store large amounts of water and nutrients so that they have something for when they can't find it. All right, so maybe they're going through a drought. Maybe they can rely on the water they have stored in these large vacuoles. Another thing the vacuoles do is they help the cells maintain its shape. All right, so if we're looking at this very large vacuole here, it takes up a lot of the cell. All right, when it's full, it tends to push the plasma membrane against the outside of the cell wall and make it very sturdy, very rigid. All right, we'll talk more about that when we talk about water and plants. All right, but the last thing that plant cells have that animal cells do not are cell walls. All right, so cell walls, they're unique to plant cells. They are an extracellular structure. All right, so when I say extracellular structure, I am talking about they are outside of that plasma membrane. All right, so if we look at our image that I have up here, all right, we have our plasma membrane, that phospholipid bilayer in this yellow color here. They are outside of that. right? So they are outside of the cell, not inside of the cell. Now the cell wall helps protect the cell, right? It helps the cell maintain its shape. So even if that vesicle kind of shrinks up, right, that cell wall is still going to stay really rigid to help the cell maintain its shape. And it provides a lot of structural support to a plant, right? So we can see in here, there's a lot going on here, lots of different molecules. They're kind of intertwined. You can kind of think of it as if you were to weave a sweater and you have all these different fibers going in and out to help maintain the shape of the fabric. Right? Kind of the same concept here. Lots of different molecules woven together to help maintain the cell's shape. Right? Most of that cellulose and different types of proteins. All right. So one of the things that's about a plant is that they have this cell wall. They could have two cell walls depending on the species we're looking at. So all plants are going to have a primary cell wall, which is in blue here. All right, so this lumen, this is the middle of the cell. All right, this is the cell wall in blue. Everything outside is extracellular. All right, so all plants are going to have a primary cell wall that tends to be very flexible, still relatively stiff compared to everything else, but more flexible than the secondary cell wall, which is towards the inside. All right, generally makes it a little bit more stiff. Right, typically a lot of woody plants might have a secondary cell wall. And then one of the things I want to just kind of throw out there is that they have this cell wall. It helps it maintain its shape, but they still have to communicate with each other, right? Cells signal to one another. So they have these channels called plasmodesmata, right? They are these channels, we can see that here, that kind of link these cells together, all right? They are typically plasma membrane lined, all right? So they still have that phospholipid bilayer in them. But they're helping link those cells together so those cells can communicate with one another. All right, before I get into some of that terminology I talked about, quickly talk amongst yourself. What are some main differences between plants and animal cells?
Wait, so what is the plasma?
All right, so this should have been a pretty easy, simple question. What are some of those main differences? What's one of them? Chloroplast, yes. And what do chloroplasts do? Photosynthesis. All right, what's another main difference? Large vacuoles, yes. Compared to animal cells, they have very large vacuoles. And what do vacuoles do? Storage, yeah. Mostly water, but they can also store nutrients and different minerals. All right, what's the last big difference? Cell wall. And what does a cell wall do? Provide structure, yeah. So a cell wall is pretty stiff, all right? It's providing structure to the cell itself. Any questions about what we talked about so far, the differences? All right. So now we're going to start talking about the plant cells themselves and what make them different from one another. All right, so if we look at plant cells, we can classify them into different categories, such as parenchyma, collenchyma, sclerenchyma, water-conducting cells, and sugar-conducting cells. All right, so I love saying the words parenchyma, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma. I think they're fun words to say out loud. One of my favorite terms in biology. So we're going to start with the parenchyma cells. All right, so the parenchyma cells, they are performing any metabolic function, right? So any function where the cell is using energy per se. They can also function in storage of water, nutrients, or synthesis of any molecules that the plant might produce, all right? So in this case, synthesis of a large process that happens in plants is photosynthesis. All right, it has the word synthesis in it. All right, so those would be parenchyma cells. All right, the cell wall itself tends to be very thin, very flexible, and they lack a secondary cell wall. All right, I'm giving you a little bit more detail than probably is necessary here, so don't feel bogged down by too many of these details. All right, these cells are living at functional maturity. That means these cells are alive when they are performing the functions that they carry out. All right, so cells that perform photosynthesis, those cells are alive. Typically, we're going to find these in the pith and the cortex of stems and roots. All right, so remember the pith and the cortex, they are part of ground tissue, right? Interior and exterior to the vascular bundles. We can also find them in the mesophyll layer of cells. All right, so that's a fancy way of saying the inside, or sorry, I said cells. Mesophyll layer of leaves. All right, that is the inside portion of the leaves. All right, if you look at the this cross section again, it's basically everything in between the epidermal cells. All right, that's the mesophyll layers. These are parenchyma cells. All right, they're typically carrying out photosynthesis. All right, the next fun word we get to say is parenchyma. All right, parenchyma cells provide support, and specifically support for growing tissues. So areas of the plant where they're actively growing, but we don't want these areas to be weak, right? We need to be strong and flexible. So typically we can think of that as petioles of a leaf, right? So if we take a leaf and it looks like that little stem structure coming off of that leaf, that is the petiole, right? That is made primarily of parenchyma cells because it is an area where the cells can actively grow, but we also need strength. If we were to look at an image of parenchyma cells, we might notice that these cell wall characteristics are very uneven, right? They're unevenly thick. So these parenchyma cells here, we see there's areas where they're very thick, areas where they tend to be thinner, right? So uneven thickness of their cell walls. They typically don't have a secondary cell wall. These cells are also living at functional maturity. So when they are providing support for growing tissues, they are alive. All right, we can find these parenchyma cells in the cortex of stems, right? So again, in ground tissue, in petioles, all right, and where flexibility but strength is needed. So anywhere else where we need to have flexibility but strength. All right, I put this image up here. If we look at the stem cross section again, we see this area where this is probably supporting a vein here. All right, but we see these cell walls are very uneven in their thickness. This is very characteristic of parenchyma. All right, the last fun word we get to say is sclerenchyma. All right, so sclerenchyma, they also provide support, but they provide support and strength in mature parts of the plant. All right, so parenchyma is providing support and strength in growing parts. Sclerenchyma is providing support and strength in mature parts of the plant. All right, they have a primary cell wall, but they also have a very, very thick and lignified secondary cell wall. So when I say lignified, it means we have the molecule lignin in it. Basically means it gives it this very thick, stiff characteristic. Now these cells are actually dead at functional maturity. So when they are providing support and strength, they are dead. Right? They are no longer living. Now we have two types of sclerenchyma cells. All right, we have fibers and sclerids. So fibers tend to be very long and skinny. Right? They kind of look like pine tree needles almost. Right? Where sclerids tend to be very short and irregular. Right? So if you've ever eaten a pear, and a pear that feels kind of gritty when you bite down, right? Those are actually sclerenchyma cells because they have this very thick secondary cell wall. You're feeling that thick lignified secondary cell wall when you chew pears. All right? Now, if we look at the location where these might be found, right? The fibers are going to be found near vascular tissues, right? Keeping the vascular tissue nice and structurally supported. And the sclerids are going to be found more exterior. So think of nutshells, seed coats, some fruits, like the pears, like I mentioned, provides that grittiness inside of the pear. All right, so we're done with the fun words. Now we're going to talk about the water conducting cells. All right, these are part of vascular tissue, and if they're water conducting, they would be part of xylem. So their function is water and nutrient transport. All right, so mostly water, but water can also carry some nutrients along with it. And they're also going to provide some support. All right, so keeping the plant upright. All right, they have a primary cell wall and also a very, again, lignified secondary cell wall. So very stiff, very thick secondary cell wall, though not as thick as sclerenchyma. Right, these cells are also dead at functional maturity. So when they are transporting water, these cells are no longer living. Right, they are dead. Right, we're going to find these in vascular tissues. So think of those vascular bundles that we saw. They can also be found in wood. All right, so the woody part of, the log you might burn in the fire, those are all dead water conducting cells. All right, and they're typically cells that are no longer being used to conduct water. Now, if we look at these water conducting cells, there's two different types. All right, so we have tracheids, which are very long and thin. Right, and we also have these vessel elements, which are wide and short. Right, now these vessel elements and these tracheids are going to be connected together via these plates that have a bunch of different pits in them. Right, so they're kind of pushed together. Maybe it's like two sieves pushed up against each other. They have a lot of holes, and that holes is where they can move the water between the different cells. All right, so if we looked at a cross-section of a leaf really closely, all right, so this is a cross-section of some cells. We see the vessel elements are very much much wider than these tracheids. Remember, they're wide and short. Tracheids are thin and long. All right, the last type of cells we're going to talk about are sugar-conducting cells. All right, so in sugar-conducting cells, we call these sieve tube elements. Now, these are alive at functional maturity, right? But unlike most of the cells in a plant, they're not going to have a lot of their organelles. They're going to have very, very basic organelles, right? They're not even going to have a nucleus, all right? But they still are alive. They have a plasma membrane, all right? But because they are dead at functional alive at functional maturity, but lack most of those organelles, they have to have these companion cells. Right, so these companion cells, if we look at these sieve tube elements, they're these long, skinny cells that we see kind of bunched up together. These companion cells are very, very small in comparison. I have that arrow pointing to one small cell there. That is a companion cell. And this companion cell basically helps regulate these sieve tube elements because they contain all of their organelles. Right? They contain nucleus, they contain ribosomes, and they serve these sieve tube elements. They help regulate them. Right? So when we're talking about sugar-conducting cells, the cells that specifically conduct the sugar, those would be the sieve tube elements. Right? But we also have to have the companion cells because they are regulating those sieve tube elements. All right. That's a lot of terminology, a lot of information thrown at you. Take some time, look at this cross-section, review the tissues and types of cells that we have learned about, and try to place them on here. Now, I know this can be a little tricky, so do your best, and we will go over it together in just a second. I should say in a couple minutes.
I assume somewhere yeah. There's somewhere parenchyma cells are important for them because those
Are we making sense of the material?
yeah,
Okay, okay. Sounds good.
but still we're not sure.
That's okay. This is a harder question. Yes.
That's fine.
Yeah.
All right, so I know this is a trickier question. So let's kind of work through it together here now that you've had a chance to think about it. All right, so on the next slide, I've kind of highlighted areas of different tissues. All right, so if I look at the one on the very top, what type of tissue is that? Dermal tissue, yeah. Yep, because it's on the exterior of the cells. It's this very thin layer on the top. It's also on the bottom here. All right, we have our epidermal cells and then the cuticle. All right, what about this very round circle that I've highlighted here? Vascular tissue, yeah, we typically see vascular tissue in different bundles. Right, and what about this area I've highlighted off to the side? Ground, yeah, it's not dermal, it's not vascular, it's ground tissue. All right, so this is where it gets a little trickier. All right, naming different types of cells. All right, so let's start at this one up here. I kind of gave you a hint when I talked about the tissue type. All right, what type of cell might be in this dermal tissue? Has the word dermal in it. starts with an E. Ooh, it's trickier than I thought. Epidermal cells. Yes, yes. So we're in the dermal tissue. These cells specifically are epidermal cells. All right. What about this kind of this thin layer above the epidermal cells? What is that? The cuticle. Yeah, very waxy layer. So not a cell type, but still an important structure. All right. If we go over here, all right, what type of cells am I going to find in this vascular tissue?
Water conducting cells.
Water conducting cells and well, water conducting. What also can we conduct in a plant? Sugar conducting cells. Yeah. So we might see tracheids or vessel elements and sieve tube elements in the vascular bundle, right? Depending on if they're conducting water or sugars. Right? Now I'm not going to have you specifically point out which is which because that even I would have trouble doing in this image. All right. Let's move to this part of the leaf cross section up here. What might that be? It's not sclerenchyma. It's not parenchyma. Parenchyma, yes, yes. So what's clued you into parenchyma is if we look at these cell walls, look how uneven they are. All right, very uneven cell walls. We also see that it's supporting this major vein. All right, so this is a major vein here. We are providing support to that. All right, so that's definitely a trickier question there. What about these cells that might be present in the ground tissue in that particular layer of the leaf?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, what type of cell might I find in this circle? It's typically green in color. That would be parenchyma. Yeah, most ground tissues are going to be parenchyma. If you were to take a guess at what type of ground tissue I'd be talking about, a good guess would be parenchyma unless I gave you more specifics. All right, so for example, maybe I said it provides support to something that's still growing, right? That'd be a little bit more specific. And that'd still be ground tissue, but that would be parenchyma. All right, now I highlighted this area at the bottom. All right, now this is a very tricky one. It's a very specific cell type in the dermal layer. You can see it's very small. We have two different cells butted up right next to each other. There's stomata. Yeah, that's a stomata. Those are guard cells. Yeah, so that's one of those specialized cell types in the dermal layer. Right? These are guard cells that make up our stomata. All right. Any questions on those cell types? It's a lot of terminology. The best way to remember these is just to keep going over it, keep reviewing it. Saying it out loud really helps. All right, if there's no questions, all right, I put this kind of table together that I'm not going to go over in class, but it kind of puts everything together in terms of the organs, the tissues, the cell types, and what their functions are. All right, so this can be a good tool if you need to study a broad overview of the plant structures. All right, so I just have a couple more slides, and then we're probably going to end a little early today. All right, so kind of some other key terms I want to introduce when we're talking about kind of basic plant biology. One of them is meristems. All right, so what are meristems? Meristems are areas of undifferentiated tissue, meaning these cells in that tissue do not have a specific function yet, right? Where the cells are basically divide, elongate, and then become differentiated, right? They start to have that specific function. All right, so they're an area where we have a lot of mitosis, so a lot of reproduction happening at this area. We're constantly creating new cells in this area. These cells don't have a specific function yet, but they will eventually turn into a specific cell type. All right, so when we think about all those different specific cell types that these cells could become, they could become guard cells, They could become parenchyma, sclerenchyma, tracheids, whichever it's destined to be, essentially, whatever the plant needs. All right, so when we look at where these meristems are located, all right, they're going to be located in areas that are actively growing. All right, so if we talk about an apical meristem, we're talking about meristems basically at the very tips of something. All right, that's typically located in the root and the shoot tips. All right, so if I'm looking at a growing stem, all right, that would be an apical meristem up here. All right, these two pieces off to the sides, those are newly formed leaves. All right, but in the middle we have that growing stem, right, an area of actively dividing cells. And then we have them in shoot tips as well. All right, so the very tip of a new root, they're going to be an area where the cells are actively dividing, creating new root cells. That would be an apical meristem as well. Now they're responsible for primary growth. So when I talk about primary growth, I am talking about growth that's going to increase our height. All right, so that's an easy way to think of it. Increasing our height. All right, it's going to be non-woody growth. All right, so if we see a plant outside that is not woody, right, so a grass, maybe it's some flowers out there, right, it doesn't have any woody parts, all of its growth is going to be primary growth. All right, now we also have lateral meristems. Right, so these are meristems that are responsible for secondary growth. So secondary growth we can think about as increasing our width, right? It's typically going to be woody. So if we have a tree that is growing wider and wider each year, that is secondary growth. Right? We have lateral meristems that are responsible for that. All right, and then I just wanted to show another image of primary growth that we talked about here, showing that we're primarily increasing our height. Right? We see primary growth at the very tips of the shoot, very tips of the roots, right? But we can also find them on all the tips of all of our lateral roots as well. All right, any areas where they're actively dividing. All right, so if we're talking about actively dividing plants, we're talking about plants that are growing, they are developing. All right, so if we talk about plant development, all right, this is something that scientists on the International Space Station are particularly interested in, the development of plants. All right, so that's a series of changes that occurs for a plant to form cells, tissues, and organs. So basically the growth of a plant. Now one of the things that we look at when we're looking at plants is called developmental plasticity. All right, so this is the ability for plants to alter their form in response to an environmental condition. All right, so we're altering our form in response to the environment. A really good study that happened back in 1940 looked at developmental plasticity in these Achilla plants growing in the Sierra Nevada range. Right, we saw this range has a bunch of different elevations to it. Right, anywhere from down more in a valley area here to up on the top of the peaks of this mountain range. Right, they looked at this plant that grew along this entire elevation gradient. All right, so elevation is our environmental pressure that we are looking at. And they found that depending on where they grew on that range, right, their height differed. Right, so plants that grew more on the higher altitudes tended to be smaller, whereas plants that grew on the lower altitudes tended to be larger. Right, now if they took a plant that grew at the peak, all right, maybe they took seeds from this plant up here and then planted it down in the valley. All right, that plant is probably going to grow tall, just like these other plants. All right, because it has developmental plasticity. It is growing in response to an environmental condition, and in this case, that environmental condition is altitude. All right, does that make sense for everybody, developmental plasticity? All right, it can be any environmental condition out there. A very classic example just happens to be altitude. All right, so think about our last thought question here. Why is developmental plasticity important, and how can it be crucial for space-bound plants? All right, talk amongst yourselves. Got kind of some answers going, so when I ask this again, you'll have some answers to give me.
So plants would do the develop plus the quickly. Yeah.
I know.
Can't spell it either. Like yeah. Oh, wow. I can just guess the spelling and I'm probably right. I'm silent.
And make sure you stop talking. Yeah.
Thought it was wrong. I just feel bad for it. Yeah.
That's class actually, like really important.
When it all went wrong. It's British. This is so important.
All right, so I handed back your timelines. Like I said, if you completed them, you automatically got 1 point. Easy point there. But why is developmental plasticity important? Yeah.
Well, I thought it's like a type of adaptation plants go through to survive.
Yeah, it's a type of adaptation that maybe an individual plant can go through versus maybe a whole population. What if I had a plant that did not have developmental plasticity? Would it be able to survive in a range of conditions? No. Yeah, so developmental plasticity is very important when we talk about a plant that maybe has to survive a bunch of different environmental conditions without dying. All right, so how is this important for space-bound plants?
It gives you a little more flexibility because you don't have to create this like perfect environment. There's like a little bit of leeway.
Yeah, exactly. It gives you flexibility in these plants. If they can adapt to a bunch of different conditions, right, they might be easier to grow in space, right? It gives you some flexibility. If we have one condition that's maybe slightly off, that plant isn't going to immediately die on us. All right. Any questions about anything we've covered? All right, so, yes, question in the back. we're talking about sclerenchyma with an S. Yes, sclerenchyma. A mature part. A part that is no longer growing. That's gonna be most of the plant, honestly. Versus like a growing part might be the tip of a root, the tip of a shoot, something that's a little bit more delicate. Plants or leaves as they're expanding, right? They're actively growing. They might have some sclerenchyma supporting their vein structures that are expanding out. So those would be kind of growing areas. Versus mature parts are going to be maybe it's a part of a stem that's already grown, is not growing anymore. That make sense? All right. Any other questions? All right. So tonight's a little less homework. All right. I'm just going to have you read an article on the electromagnetic spectrum, watch a video on light. We will be discussing light tomorrow. Be prepared to take another quiz that's, again, very easy, very similar to what you took today. And then keep in mind that you do have endurance to read. I do want you to prepare 3 discussion questions. I have already put the submission online for that. It's under next Tuesday's module in Moodle. So if you feel like you want to get ahead of the game, that is up there if you do want to submit early.
The 3 discussion questions are about the chapters.
Yeah, chapters 1 through 5. Yep.